Have you ever found yourself caught in the agonizing gap between knowing what you should do and actually doing it? You read the scriptures, you hear the sermons, you absorb the wisdom, you see the path with absolute clarity. Yet, when the moment of decision arrives, a strange paralysis sets in. You default back to the old, comfortable, and ultimately destructive patterns. This is the isolation of the seer, the unique pain of the conscious person who possesses the blueprint for a better life but struggles to lay the first brick. The world encourages this split. It applauds the intellectual understanding of virtue but often penalizes the embodiment of it. This disconnect is more than just laziness. It is a profound form of self-deception, a spiritual and psychological lie we tell ourselves that allows us to coast on good intentions while our actual lives crumble under the weight of inaction. This struggle makes us question our faith, our strength, and even the very truth of the wisdom we hold. The cost of this passive listening is not abstract. It's paid in the currency of lost opportunities, stagnant growth, and an ever-widening chasm between your ideal self and your actual self. You feel the subtle, soul-level fatigue that comes from constantly consuming spiritual food without ever digesting and using the nutrients. This intellectual appreciation of truth becomes its own comfortable trap, a sophisticated spiritual bypass where we confuse our ability to analyze virtue with the genuine effort of living it. We believe the lie that our depth of understanding somehow absolves us from the authentic discipline required to transform that knowledge into character. Today, we will confront this ultimate form of internal sabotage. We will use the ultimate scriptural insight to close the gap between your clear seeing and your decisive action, moving you from mere hearer to doer of the most powerful truths. B. The foundational illumination. The core message of this required transformation is captured with startling clarity and directness in the book of James, a profound text often called the practical manual for the Christian life. The apostle writes in James 1 verse 22, "Do not merely listen to the word, and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says." This verse is not a simple encouragement. It is an active warning against a specific and destructive psychological state. The deception James speaks of is the belief that passive acknowledgement of truth is equivalent to active compliance with it. To asterisk merely listen is to allow the profound, life-altering power of the word to wash over you, providing temporary solace but leaving your fundamental behavioral patterns untouched. This single verse serves as the biblical anchor for understanding the moral causality of our existence. James is essentially defining faith not as a set of intellectual beliefs, but as a dynamic principle of action. The very structure of the verse implies a teleological link. The purpose of hearing the word is doing the word. When we fail in this, we aren't just forgetful, we are actively engaging in self-deception. We are effectively lying to ourselves about the nature of our commitment, and consequently, delaying the very blessing and transformation that the word promises. The word is not a museum piece to be admired. It is a surgical tool designed to restructure the landscape of our soul. To acknowledge its truth without permitting its work is to choose spiritual stagnation, creating an internal dissonance that prevents the formation of a unified soul. See the deep dive, psychology and philosophy. The mechanism of consequence. The wisdom in James 1 verse 22 is a profound lesson in behavioral psychology. The act of listening creates a temporary sense of moral satisfaction, the halo effect, which tricks the brain into believing the ethical requirement has been met. By merely listening, we generate an emotional and intellectual high without expending the energy necessary for real-world application. This cognitive shortcut is what James calls self-deception. Psychologically, this is an exercise in ethical regression, where the individual consistently moves backward from the high standard they intellectually understand. They retreat into a pattern of performative belief, where the external appearance of piety, listening to the word, replaces the internal reality of character formation, doing the word. Philosophically, this verse addresses the teleology of existence, the idea that everything has an inherent purpose or end goal. The Word of God, in this context, is the telos for human behavior. It dictates the optimal way to live. When we are only hearers, we create an existential imbalance. We align our minds with the ultimate purpose but keep our will and our actions disconnected. This disconnect ensures that the law of reaping and sowing, Galatians 6 verse 7, will only manifest a harvest of internal conflict and external stagnation. The person who sees the truth clearly but fails to act on it is actively undermining their own potential, creating a psychic fracture in their being. The solution is not more study, but authentic discipline, the focused, intentional effort to close the gap between the illuminated mind and the engaged will. This is the only way to merge the seer with the doer and forge the unified soul. D. The interconnected list. 1. The pattern of intellectual anesthesia, moral causality. The first clear manifestation of the hearer-only syndrome is the adoption of intellectual anesthesia. This occurs when one accumulates spiritual knowledge but uses it as a shield to avoid the painful necessity of change. The person can brilliantly articulate the principles of forgiveness, humility, or patience, yet their daily life is marked by bitterness, arrogance, or impatience. The moral causality here is clear. The energy that should be applied to doing is instead channeled into analyzing and critiquing. This sophisticated form of spiritual bypassing leads to a predictable life pattern where the individual is highly regarded in spiritual discussions, but consistently fails to maintain healthy relationships or disciplined personal habits. Their failure to act on the word is a slow, steady poisoning of their own moral ground. The consequence is a life characterized by inauthentic power. The intellectual anesthetic dulls the pain of conscience, allowing the individual to perpetually postpone transformation. They become experts in talking about God's law without ever submitting their own actions to it. This lack of practical application means they are constantly drawing on spiritual reserves they have not replenished through action, resulting in spiritual exhaustion and emotional burnout. This pattern is the foundation of self-deception, convincing the individual that their comprehension is a suitable substitute for their consecration. The external display is one of wisdom, but the internal reality is one of consistent spiritual regression. 2. The isolation of the vain observer, conscious distance. The second pattern is the isolation of the vain observer, which transforms clear spiritual sight into a tool for judgment rather than a foundation for service. The person who only hears becomes excellent at seeing the hypocrisy and failures of others, but blind to their own. This critical eye is not used for self-correction, but for creating a conscious distance, a safe intellectual boundary that elevates the observer above the flawed, acting masses. They confuse their discernment of the truth with their obedience to the truth. This is a severe failure of the doer mandate because the highest truths of the gospel are inherently relational and active. They demand engagement, service, and vulnerability, not detached commentary. This distance is a direct result of the unapplied word. The truths of the Bible compel us toward humility and love. When these truths are not done, they metastasize into pride and self-righteousness. The spiritual backlash is inevitable. The very clarity of sight that should bring peace, instead, brings perpetual frustration with the world and a deep, chronic loneliness. They are isolated because they have made themselves unavailable to the messiness of actual living, which is where the word must be applied. By refusing to do the word, they have essentially walled themselves off, ensuring that their profound internal wisdom has no practical external impact, leaving their own soul unified only in its judgment. 3. The habitual cycle of ethical regression, the law of reaping sowing. The hearer only perpetually falls victim to the habitual cycle of ethical regression. This is the practical outworking of the law of reaping and sowing. If the seed you are planting is passive listening without active doing, the harvest will be cyclical failure in your personal life. For example, The person knows they should be honest in their finances, but continues to cut corners, hearing the word, but not doing it. The temporary gain is invariably followed by a larger, systemic loss, a crisis of trust, a financial audit, or a broken relationship. The root cause is the failure to apply the foundational principles of integrity when it is inconvenient. The ethical regression is a pattern of continually returning to the lower standard despite knowing the higher one. The scriptural knowledge, when unacted upon, does not lift the person up. It merely gives them a more articulate vocabulary for explaining their failures. The consequence is a loss of internal and external trust. They cannot trust themselves to follow through, and those around them eventually stop trusting their promises. This is the scriptural principle in action. You are literally sowing seeds of self-deception, and therefore reaping a harvest of internal dissonance and external chaos. The only way to break this cycle is through authentic discipline, forcing the will to execute the known truth, regardless of the temporary discomfort. 4. The illusion of spiritual maturity, wisdom of silence. Finally, the hearer only creates an illusion of spiritual maturity, which becomes a major obstacle to true growth. They possess the language of faith and the intellectual framework of wisdom, often confusing this facility with genuine character. They are comfortable speaking about profound truths, but when a situation demands a quiet, sacrificial act of virtue, they are paralyzed. This relates directly to the wisdom of silence. The truly mature soul often practices the wisdom they possess rather than constantly proclaiming it. The hearer is loud in his talk and silent in his action. The tragic end point of this illusion is that they never move into a life of genuine power, because power in the biblical sense is predicated on humble, consistent action. By failing to do what it says, they are essentially living a spiritual performance, and like all performances, it is sustained only by external validation. The internal experience of a life governed by the word, peace, genuine joy, and resilient character remains elusive. Their inability to act is the silent testimony that the word has not been fully absorbed, only intellectually rented. The only way to shatter this illusion is to intentionally put a premium on action over analysis, forcing the intellectual capacity to serve the disciplined will. 5. Conclusion and call to discipline. The profound truth revealed in James 1 verse 22 is that the Christian life is not a spectator sport. It is an active discipline. The gap between hearing and doing is the birthplace of all spiritual and psychological confusion. Every time you consciously know the good you ought to do, the moment you see the truth of the word, but choose inaction, you are actively practicing the skill of self-deception. You are cultivating a divided soul, where your intellect is at war with your will. The path forward, the road to the unified soul, is paved with authentic discipline. It begins not with a grand gesture, but with the consistent, often hidden choice to do the word in the smallest of moments. Today, this moment, choose to close the gap. Do not let your clear seeing become your greatest burden. Let the truth you have heard today be the catalyst for the action you take tomorrow. The power of the scripture is not in its reading, but in its doing. Be a doer, and watch as the chaos of the divided soul gives way to the invincible peace and power of a life lived in action. Your single next step is not to read more, but to choose one small truth you know you need to embody, a difficult conversation, an act of patience, or a commitment to integrity, and execute it with absolute, uncompromising faithfulness today.